Have you ever looked at your database diagram and thought, wow, that's kind of ugly? Same. That's why in this video, I'm going to show you how you can create a widget in Figma to automatically generate a database diagram. So if you want to see how I do this using the Figma API, the PlanetScale API, and the Node SQL parser module, stick around. A logical schema diagram is one that visually represents the schema of your database. It includes a node for every table in the database, as well as information about the names and the types of each column, and indicators for the primary keys and links to represent the foreign keys to other tables. Now, there's already a bunch of tools out there for building these kinds of diagrams for your database, and if you're a MySQL user, one of these tools is MySQL Workbench. This is pretty cool, but one of the downsides of this is that those diagrams don't necessarily look that nice. And if you want a nice looking diagram that you can put in some sort of public-facing interface, you'll probably want it to look good, and you'll want to use some kind of design tool like Figma. So that's why in this video, I'm going to create a widget that can generate these diagrams in Figma. To start, I need to create a new widget project in Figma. So to do this, go to a Figma project that you have, right-click on the canvas, go to Widgets, Development, and then New Widget. So this one I'm going to call Diagram Generator. And then I'm going to just go to Next, have it be simple, and save it, and there it goes. So now that's been created, I need to open it up in VS Code. There's a few things I need to do before I can try this out. You may notice that this Figma has a red squiggly underline on it, and I actually need to install the typings before I can build this. So I'm going to say npm install, and then Figma, and plugin typings. So that's going to go hopefully pretty quick. And then once that finishes, I also am going to start a build task. So I'm going to start a build task with watch and let it build. And then what I can do is switch over to Figma and test and see if this is working properly. So in Figma, I can right click, go to Widgets, Development, click Diagram Generator, and it produces the default widget. So great, but now I need to customize it for my own purposes. What I'm going to do is I'm going to build a simple user interface that has a text box, which will allow the user to plop in some create table statements, and then also some text that can be clicked on to cause the diagram to be generated. One of the things I'm actually going to do is delete a bunch of the code that comes by default and change this. So I'm going to create a custom user interface for this, and I want to make sure and import the input value. And I'm going to create an auto layout, and I'm going to create an input within that, and also some text within that. Okay, so for this auto layout, I want its direction to be vertical, and I want to specify some padding in there as well. Okay. For the text, actually what I'm going to do up here is I'm going to change this to be set text, and this is what's going to store the DDL component. And then in the input, what I want to do is set its value to be equal to text, but then I also want to say on text edit end, this is going to be a function that gets called when the input editing is completed. And what I want to do in here is update the value of the text state. So I want to say set text e.characters, and that's going to be the value that's within the text box. And then I want to set a bunch of other options here. So fill, I'm going to set to a color. I'm going to set a font size, 15, width, 200, height, 200, give it a little bit of space there. And then I want to give it, input frame props. So some values for the input frame. So the fill is going to be equal to white. And the stroke is just going to be black. And then the padding is going to be 10. And the corner radius, I'll set this to 10 as well. All right, what is it not like about my on edit text end here? What is this? Number is not assignable to string. Oh, okay, I need to set that to be a string here, and stroke, great. So clean that up, and then down here, I want to make sure and set an on click for the text, and for now, I'm just gonna print out what I put in the text variable. Later on, of course, I'm gonna want this to actually call a function which starts generating the diagram. And here I'm going to say generate diagram. And I'll give this a font size as well. So font size equals 20. So that's some nice big text. Okay, so this is looking good, still registering the widget. And so now it's time to go see if this looks good in Figma. Now I'm in Figma here and I can right click, say widgets, development, diagram generator. And there's the diagram generator. And I can test this out by saying hi there and see if this prints to the console when I click generate diagram. And it does. Next, I'm going to install the Node SQL parser module, which I'm going to use for parsing out the create table statements. In order to do that, I'm going to say npm install Node SQL parser. And then I'm also going to say npm install save dev types node. So with that, I should be able to start using the module. And I'm going to try this out here by saying const equals parser equals require node SQL parser. Okay, so that import is working okay, and then I'm going to create a little function where I can try this out. So I'm going to say generate diagram, and I'm going to assume that I get some DDL as a string passed in here. And I'm going to write a little bit of code that uses it to get it parsed. So parser, a new parser. And then from here, I'm going to say result equals parser.astify. And this is a function that's going to take some string and parse it out. And then I'm just going to say console.log and print out that result. And what I should get is a JavaScript object with the parsed information of DDL, if it's getting valid DDL. So now I'm going to go down and update this function here to call generate diagram with that text, and I can test and see if it's working correctly. In order to do that, I'm going to use this test.SQL schema that has 3 tables, users, posts, and messages, and a handful of columns and primary and foreign keys. So I'm going to take this, copy it over, and bring it into Figma. And I'm going to paste it into my input field and then click Generate Diagram. And it prints out an array representing each of these 3 create table statements. And I can dig into this one and even see that it is for the users table. So this is a good start. Now I need to move on to the next step of actually beginning to generate the diagram. Now I'm going to provide some starter code, which you can access in the link down in the description. But this is going to help make the video move along a little bit quicker. And so there's a bunch of helper functions in this dbcomponents.tsx file. One for creating an icon for a key, another for creating a table title rectangle, as well as a column rectangle, one for creating a frame for a table, as well as a few other functions like a function to connect 2 elements together, a function for loading fonts, and functions for determining if something is a primary or a foreign key, based on the structure of the parsed JavaScript object. So these will be utilized in the remainder of the video for building the diagram. So what I'm going to do is jump in here and add a couple of things to get started with diagram generation. So what I need to do is say dbcomponents.load fonts, because I want to get those loaded, and then after those load, I want to call this function that I've created in here called create table. And actually, before I call that, I want to write a loop that can go through the let I equals 0, I is less than results.length, and then I++. So I want to go through the results because this result would actually be an array. So let's see, an array of object, since this is TypeScript. And this is going to be result. And so as it goes through that, I want to call create table for each one of those table elements. This would be result at index I. And then for the x coordinate, I want to say, I want to do I times 500 to separate them by 500, and then just 0 for the y coordinate. So to keep it simple, just put them all in a row. And then in here, I want to start utilizing my function for building out the diagram. So I've already created this array of scene nodes, which I'll use to build things. But what I want to do is call dbcomponents.create table title rect. And so this is going to be for the title component of a table. and I want to give it an X and a Y coordinate, and I also want to say table info.table at index0.table. Now this is something, because I researched it in advance, I know where to grab the title of the table from, but if you wanted to do this yourself, you may want to poke around and see what information you need from that parsed object. So I'm going to go ahead and nodes.push this because I want to push all the nodes that I create into my nodes array. And then what do I want to do here? I actually want to go and create, let I equals 0, another loop for, so while I is less than table info dot create definitions dot length, and then I++. Okay. So I also want to, for every one of the columns, create something that has the name and the type for that column. So what I'm going to say is the entry equals table info dot create definitions at index I. And then if the entry dot, what is the entry dot resource, if that's not equal to column, because there can be other things other than column in this area, I would just want to continue. But if it is a column, I want to call my custom function for building that column rectangle. So here I would say db components dot create column rectangle. And for this, I'm going to give it the same X value, but for the Y value, because I want this to grow downward for every row, I'm going to say y plus 55, because each of these would be a height of 50, plus I times 55. So that little formula would get the right thing. And then I'm going to say entry here, entry, and that would create that. And I'm also going to say nodes.push. So that goes on there. Okay, and then soon I can test this out, but I also want to say the following. So at the end, Figma .viewport, I want to set the viewport, scroll and zoom into view, the nodes, so that when it generates the diagram, it allows me to see them and kind of fits it to the screen properly, and then say Figma.group nodes and Figma.current page. So put those into a group in the current page. Okay, so I've got some basic logic here for creating the table titles and the rectangles for the columns. I'm going to go see if it's going to work right. I have it open here in Figma, and now I'm just going to click Generate Diagram again with that same schema, and boom, it's created the entries for those 3 tables. It has the names of the tables as well as the values of the columns and their respective types. So this is a really great start, and they can even be moved around. And so next up is to start working on things like the primary and foreign keys. For the primary key, what I want to do is say if db components.isPK, and then I'm going to pass it in the table info as well as the column name, which the column name is entry.column, column.column. And so if that is indeed a primary key, I want to create a label for it. So I'm going to say db components.create key icon. And for this, I'm going to pass it some coordinates. Let's see, this is actually going to be similar to this, but then I'm just going to add 10 to it to offset it a little bit. I want to say PK, and then I'm going to give it a color. So the red is going to be not that bright, the green is going to be kind of medium, 0.5, and then the blue is going to be 1.0. So I want it to be primarily a blue icon that says PK. So after adding nodes.push there, I'm going to go see if this works. I'm going to go click Generate Diagram, and what it should do is display the diagram with the primary key indicators. That's great. Now I need to get the foreign keys to work, which will be similar, but a little bit more complicated because I need to draw links between tables. So while you weren't looking, I went and added a little bit of extra code in here to help with this foreign key stuff. I created this tables and columns data structure and a couple of other changes in here. But now it's time to go down and get the foreign key stuff working. So I'm going to say let fk equals db components dot is fk. And this function is going to take the same parameters, but it works a little bit different, where if it is not a foreign key, it's going to return undefined. And if it is, it returns the name of the table and the column that it's a foreign key to. What I'm going to do is nodes.push, and I'm going to create the key icon. In fact, it's going to be a very similar function to this, but I'm going to change a few things. So I'm going to make this foreign key, and I'm going to change the color of it so that it is green instead of blue. And then, where Where did I go? And then I'm going to make sure and draw the appropriate link. So in order to do this, I'm going to say let 2 equals tables and columns. That's that data structure I referred to. And I'm going to say get fk.table, and then I'm going to say get fk.column. And I'm going to assume that it gives me something back successfully, and this data structure is designed to be able to, using a table name and a column name, get the visual element that corresponds with that column. So if it gives me back the appropriate rectangle, then I'm going to say dbcomponents.connect, using that connect helper function, the rect and 2. So the current rectangle to the 2 element. So with this, hopefully it is going to detect foreign keys and be able to link them up correctly. Now to test this in Figma. Over here, I'm using the same schema, and I'm going to click the Generate Diagram button, and then it generates the diagram. And now it has foreign key indicators as well as connecting lines to indicate where the foreign keys go to. So far, this is looking really good. Right now, the widget is set up to require users to paste in the create table statements in order to generate a diagram. But I would like the user to be able to connect to a PlanetScale database and fetch the schema from there. In order to do this, I'm going to use the PlanetScale API. And if you haven't used the API before, you definitely should check it out if you are a PlanetScale user. You can use the API to do all kinds of stuff like create databases, delete databases, do backups, deploy requests, tons of stuff. What I'm particularly going to need for this is under database branches, I want to use the get branch schema endpoint. So this will allow me to make a request to the API and get the schema. What I need to give this is I need to give it the org name, the database name, and the branch name just to specify what to get the schema from. But I also need to give it 2 other bits of information as a part of the service token. PlanetScale service tokens give you the ability to give different users access to orgs or databases. If you've ever used GitHub personal access tokens, these are very similar to those, and I'm going to show you how you can create one. What you would do is you would go into your PlanetScale organization and go over to settings and then service tokens, and then create a new service token. I'm going to call this one Figma and say create service token. And then what you need to do is make sure and copy and save these 2 bits of information, because this is the service token ID and then the token itself. So then you can click continue to token permissions, and then you can go set some permissions. So I'm going to make sure and give it some organizational permissions to read and hit save. And then I'm going to also give it database specific permissions, and I'm going to add a database and have it be for the Figma database and tell it that it can read the database and it can read branch, and I'm going to hit save. This service token is now created, and I can use that token ID and the token string itself to make API requests using the PlanetScale API. So now it's time to go back to the Figma widget and link all this together. In order to do this, I need to make some changes to my user interface. And one of the things I'm actually going to do is create a bunch of new state values, 5 in particular. And this is going to be for the token ID, for the token, for the org, for the database, and for the branch. Now I'm going to update the setter functions for these. So set token ID, set token, set org, set database, and set branch. And then lastly, change the keys for these. So this is going to be token ID, token, org, database, and branch. Okay, so these states, then what I need is an input text box for each one of these. So I have one right here, and I'm going to update this to be token ID, set token ID. But what I'm going to want to do is basically copy this for the 5 other inputs. So I'm going to take this and repeat it several more times down here. So 1, 2, 3, and 4. And I just need to change these so that they're for the correct inputs. So this one is going to be for token, set token. This one's going to be for the org. I'm going to call set org. This is going to be the database one, database, and lastly, the branch. And in PlanetScale, right, each branch can have different schema, so you need to be able to specify which branch as well. Okay, so I've got those and this generate diagram. I'm going to comment that out. And so the user interface now has a bunch of input boxes, 2 for token related stuff and 3 for specifying which PlanetScale database. And now I need to actually make an API request to grab the schema. Now, in order to do that, I'm going to do this inside of this onClick function, and I'm going to say async, and I'm going to create a function that's going to get called. And in this, I'm going to make the request. Now I'm going to go ahead and paste in the URL here. And so this is the API URL, and then you specify the org, database, and branch, and those will be grabbed from these different state values up here. And from here, I need to call the fetch function. Now, the fetch function is similar, but a little bit different technically than sort of the default one that you would be used to if you're making like an AJAX request from a browser. But it's still called fetch, and I'm just going to give it the URL, and then I'm going to give it some parameters. So I'm going to say method is get, and then one of the key components to this is the authorization header. So that's the other one that I want to give it down here. Or actually, I want to say that the headers are going to be the following, and the main header that I need to give is authorization. And for this is going to be the token ID plus a colon in between, and then plus the token itself, right? And so that's going to make up basically the authorization. So that's going to give this the ability to actually authenticate that API request so that it can get a response from the server and give me what I need. So that's the response. And then I'm going to say object equals await the response.json. So I want to get it back as an object, right? So it's going to process the JSON and turn it into a JavaScript object. And then what I want is the create statements for the schema. And in order to do this, I'm going to write a for loop that goes through and gets all of those out. So object.data.length. And again, if you wanted to kind of poke around more, you could actually look at the JSON that it sends back to see the formatting. I just need to grab each of the raw elements at each of the elements in this data array. So I'm going to say creates plus equals object.data at index I. And I'm going to grab raw, which is basically just the raw text for the create table statement. So what is it not like here? Creates. Const, so I'll just say let instead. And then down here for generating the diagram, I'm going to want to pass it in creates, which should be the create table statements from the, I need to move this to up here, from what I got back from PlanetScale. So I've got all of this, and then I do need to make sure that I actually call that function. That should work correctly as long as I implemented it all right. One other thing to note is you got to make sure and go and change your network access to allow making connections to the PlanetScale API. So make sure and put something like this in your manifest.json file for the widget. Okay, moment of truth. Time to test if this works. So I'm going to go ahead and put video in as my organization. I'm going to put Figma in as my database, and then the main branch. And I already have the token ID and token in there. So I'm going to click generate, and it created the diagram. I have the same schema in there that I was testing with earlier. And so it created users and messages and posts. And so now this is here in FigJam, and this can also be copied into a Figma design file if you want to customize the color, design, and style of this. I covered a ton of stuff in this video, from the Figma API to the PlanetScale API and service tokens, and ultimately getting it all working in Figma. So hopefully this inspires you to build cool things with the PlanetScale API, and perhaps this can inspire you to get creative and figure out new ways to leverage this API to help improve your development workflow with PlanetScale. If you enjoyed this video and learned a thing or two, please like the video and subscribe to the PlanetScale channel, and I will talk to you in the next one.